In this video, we're tearing down and rebuilding a vintage Rockwell joiner that I purchased at an estate sale for $30 last year. I've rebuilt tools and appliances like this in the past, and it's a great way to learn how the machine works while making maintenance and tuning less of a mystery. Legend has it that if you restore the tool of a deceased craftsman, you inherit all of their abilities. Let's get started. First step to rebuilding any machine should be to head over to vintagemachinery.org, where tons of folks have uploaded obscure and hard to find parts diagrams and user manuals. I was able to find a user manual and parts list for a very similar jointer, which helped to clarify a few mysteries. More on that later. Let's begin our disassembly by releasing tension and removing the belt. Penetrating oil was used to loosen up the old joints, but everything really came apart easily. Make sure you take a lot of photographs or even recordings of this disassembly process. I promise you'll be wishing you had it later. Let's talk about this motor for a sec. My original plan was to rebuild the existing motor. After disassembling it and taking a peek, I realized it was of poor quality and was just full of nasty dust. This motor's obviously been replaced, as it's supposed to be a half horsepower motor spinning at 3,450 RPM. I turned to Craigslist, where I found this motor for $100. It's beefy. I wasn't really digging the beige, so I masked off the nameplate and shaft, gave the motor a quick wipe down with mineral spirits, then sprayed it using black trim-clad paint. The motor shaft was given the wire brush treatment and fitted with a 6 1/4 inch sheave so it would spin slightly faster. It's a 1 horsepower motor weighing almost 3 times as much. This motor is also easier to rewire to 220 volts later on down the road. I used a combination of forum posts and parts lists to find the final ratio at my cutter head speeds. The cutter head was easily removed by loosening 2 bolts. The rods and components which support the infeed table were removed, and the infeed table was separated from the main body. All of the rivets which hold the nameplates in place were hammered out using a small nail and a hammer from the inside out. As you can see, this thing requires a bit of cosmetic attention. Normally, I would visit my local sandblasting shop, but it's closed due to COVID. So first we're going to brush on some paint stripper and then give it a few minutes to loosen up all the old paint. A wire brush bit on a corded power drill worked exceptionally well at removing any of the dirt and debris from the cast iron parts. A hand brush was used to get into any tight spots. And a scraper is sufficient when working with smoother parts. All of the parts were then cleaned using mineral spirits, and any unwanted areas were masked off using painter's tape. I then primed it using standard aerosol primer. And notice I don't care about overspray on the top deck because we'll clean that up later. For paint, I'm using oil-based trim-clad and gloss gray, which is mixed with 1 part lacquer thinner to 1 part paint so that it can be sprayed through an HVLP gun. I then used a wire brush to remove all the overspray from the top deck, making sure that the brush was spinning away from the body and not running onto that fresh paint. I read up on a bunch of forums on refinishing cast iron, and I ended up going with WD-40 and a Scotch-Brite pad, which worked out great. The wire brush also works here, and you can seal everything in with a coat of wax once you're finished. The only areas that won't polish up nice are areas that are actually pitted. Now for this, you would actually have to get it remachined, and it's just not worth it here. All of the moving components were then cleaned using a wire brush on a Dremel before proceeding to assembly. All of the nameplates were then cleaned using some mineral spirits, then fastened using the same rivets that were cleaned with a wire brush. So the knives look like they're in pretty good shape. Now this is probably because they were placed before, but I am going to sharpen them, and to do that I first have to remove the knives by loosening off these 4 bolts. To do that I'm going to have to grind down a wrench in order to fit into this small area. I have a 12-inch planer blade sharpening jig which I made in the past. It doesn't work so well with 6-inch joiner knives, as they need to be fastened into the jig. Both DIY Tyler and Gunflint Designs have excellent videos on creating a jointer knife sharpening jig. You'll find links to their videos in the description below. I wanted to experiment and see if a 3D printed sharpening jig would work well in this situation. I'll be sure to put all the files up on Thingiverse should you want to reproduce one yourself. The jointer knives are short enough that they can be sharpened using a standard whetstone. I have also had success sharpening blades with a cast iron table saw and 600 grit sandpaper. With the blades nice and sharp, I followed the procedure outlined in that original instruction manual. Basically, what you do is install the blades such that the height can be adjusted, then use a straight edge on the outfeed side of the table, and you adjust the height of the blade such that it just contacts the straight edge. And then once it's in its final position, you tighten down all the bolts. The cutter head pulley can then be reinstalled. The fence was then reassembled, and then polished using the same technique used on the bed of the jointer. The jointer was missing a hand knob, so I 3D printed a new one and glued it to the old threaded rod using 5-minute epoxy. And the final piece is installed, the blade guard, aka the pork chop. That sums up the rebuild process. In the next video, we're going to build a mobile base station, add some extra functionality, and fire the unit up for the first time. Consider subscribing to the channel. We'll see you in the next video.